I'd like to talk about Vietnam. And admittedly, my understanding of the region is probably woefully inadequate, despite past month or two of trying to immerse myself into the history. It's a alleged 20,000-year-old history. How could I possibly speak with any actual authority? And I don't. This is just exploring the narratives. And the thing that triggered a lot of this was, we're going to look at pictures as usual, but then I'm going to dive into some of the backstory behind the narrative behind some of these buildings, and I'll let you decide if the stories make sense. Because I seem to run into some similarities that we see in the Western United States, and we see a lot of fringe places, the same sort of underlying narrative that just explains some of this architecture. And I guess I'll leave it up to you to decide if the stories are to be believed or not. Well, we all come to our own version of the truth that makes sense to our own Brians. So, in a brief summary, this is, just as it is in so many nations I've looked at, this region has been a battleground of empires and a symbol of resistance. And we see this very often. The land that we now know as the nation-state of Vietnam was an alleged wild and untamed frontier with a favorable climate and high rainfall and fertile soils and abundant resources, and it became an ideal location for the development of agriculture. And there are significant eras in Vietnam's ancient history. The rise of the Dong Son culture, named after the village of Dong Son, and I apologize if I'm butchering some of the language here. They're renowned for the advanced bronze working skills, and they produce some of these intricate bronze artifacts, the famous drums, and the sophistication of the metallurgy there is pretty astonishing. The wax casting techniques they mastered, and they create these detailed and ornate designs. But the Dong Son weren't the only culture to leave their mark in Vietnam. It's almost a tale of two regions. To the south, like what's now central Vietnam, there's alleged Austronesian type culture, part of the bigger family of seafaring peoples who were told spread across the islands of Southeast Asia, and their skill was ironworking, and their burial jars that we accredit to them are adorned with precious beads made from jade and glass. And what it speaks to primarily is a culture that has trade networks and an underlying spiritual depth. And these early cultures, although they're distinct, they lay the groundwork for what would eventually become the Vietnamese identity. Now, there's some, with every good culture, there's fact and legend. And we're told that the first Vietnamese state was founded in 2879 BC by Kinh Jun Vong, who's a descendant of the Dragon Lord and the Mountain Fairy. So this mythical union between the dragon and the fairy, which is interesting symbolically, is said to have given birth to this Vietnamese people. And Kinh Jun Vong's son continued his dad's legacy and rules over the kingdom, which is the precursor to modern Vietnam. His descendants were known as, well, they're credited with establishing the first administrative structures, the military systems, the cultural practices that would define the early Vietnamese state. And although all this period is shrouded in mystery, it's clear that the foundations were being laid. And there's an enduring legend from this time period that there's a young boy who in a moment of crisis grew into a giant and led the people to victory against invaders riding an iron horse and wielding an iron sword, and symbolizing the resilience and bravery that would rightfully come to define the Vietnamese spirit. And the story passes down through generations, and it's a reminder of the enduring power of national unity and strength that comes from standing together against a common foe. And so, who is this common foe? Well, we are told that China, in a period often referred to as the 1,000 years of northern domination, it's a time of suffering and a time of resistance, and the Han Dynasty's conquest, it signals the beginning of this long, complex relationship between Vietnam and China. Cultural exchange, yet conflict, and the Chinese were told and sought to impose their language and their customs and their political structures, yet failing, and eventually, Vietnamese retain their strong sense of identity. They resist assimilation, and they fight back whenever the opportunity arose. And there's a famous story of resistance where the Trun sisters lead a rebellion against the Han governor in an act of vengeance, and the sisters are eventually martyred and beheaded, and it's sort of a short-lived independent state. And we're told that the two cultures influence each other, and we're also told that at some point the Mongol invasion was thwarted. In the 13th century, the alleged Mongol Empire, the powerful military forces repelled using guerrilla tactics and taking advantage of the natural terrain, and this is a pattern that would repeat over the next, I guess, according to legend, 600 years as they would use these same tactics against the French and eventually against America. And in a rather murky, troublesome era of events. And I'm not dealing with that primarily simply because we don't have we're looking at the architecture. And what we're told is the architecture is largely, even the only reason I touch on these two periods is because the architecture is allegedly a blend of Chinese and this is what we are told is the largest influence on the buildings we're going to look at today. And we're told that beginning with a punitive expedition for the persecution of Catholic missionaries, and the French army, after 50 years of conflict, they controlled this area in Southeast Asia. It took dozens of years. And they called this the Indo-Chinese Union. They created this in 1887 to include the colony of what they called Cochin China, which is 4 protectorates, Laos, Cambodia, and then Tonkin and Annam. And the 2 regions of Tonkin and Annam are what today combine to what we consider the nation-state of Vietnam. And we're told similar to Japan, in the 1840s, there was an emperor named Tu Duc who shut Vietnam off from the outside world, refused all efforts to modernize the country. And he was confident that France was too involved with all the chaos, understandably, that existed in Europe after 1848. And at some point, for some unnamed crime, which was probably earned, by my estimation, the execution of 2 Spanish Jesuit Catholic missionaries. And this coincided with the Second Opium War, somehow, where France and Britain were, dispatching a joint military expedition to attack China and force them, to buy opium. And also, we're told at the same time, Napoleon III leads this expedition against Vietnam, captures the port of Da Nang, and slowly makes their way up to Saigon. And this leads to an era of French influence. And I'll touch a little bit more on this a bit later. For now, let's look at some of the pitches of the architecture that I've hoarded. And for a minute, let's go ahead and recklessly speculate on their appearance. If you're familiar with this channel, then you're not too surprised that this is in Vietnam. But if you're coming from the outside, it's not what you'd expect. At least it's not what I would expect. Because normally we just look at the pictures. I'm going to go into some of the details about the backstory of some of these buildings because I find them to be so baffling. But for now, we'll just look at the idea that these buildings exist in Vietnam and why. Not what I would expect after 1,000 years of Chinese influence and just a brief period of time under French influence. So here's St. Joseph's Cathedral in Hanoi, obviously looking very dated and also looking very much like what you see all over the earth. This is the National Library of Vietnam, and if you are just checking things out, you see a familiar type logo that you see everywhere from California to Russia to everywhere we've looked, along with these columns and things. It's just not what you'd expect out of Vietnam. This is the Vietnamese Museum of Revolution, complete with cannons and everything else, and the same type of big jukebox sort of look that we've covered in other videos. I just found it to be odd. This is the École Française Oriental section, which we'll get into the point of these buildings a little bit later. This is from early 1900s. And the Bai Ding Kang Tam Quan. I don't know what that means. That's just my notes here. Forgive if I butchered that, but this clearly shows the flared rooftops that you would find and resonates heavily along with the Chinese influence. There is a little bit of a rose window type thing happening here. And the structure and the statuary, there are similarities, including the red brick, but it does hold a distinctive Chinese influence. And most of these I try not to do repeats. Most of these are temples, if you can imagine. That's what we're told. They're temples and pagodas. And here you've got the finial theme on top that you see everywhere. And just very interesting structures. Now, you could get rid of the flared oriental rooftop, and this would look like a bandstand or other type tower. It's not it's just stylistically different, but it is octagonal, and these are the same sort of things that you see everywhere. The wrought iron. This is also in Ho Chi Minh City, and not too many surprises, which is the surprising thing. This is the Basilica de Nuestra Senora, Ciudad Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam. Now that makes sense. You might as well with a name like that, and a rose window like this, and a construction like this, and a statue like this. You would not expect this to be Vietnam. And what we're told to to understand is that the brief time that France had this location under their rule, even though I looked at the statistic, the chart point of its largest, at maximum 0.2% of the population were ever French, based on their numbers. So it makes no sense that such a tiny percent of the population would be able to influence such a wide range of palatial buildings, even to have the manpower to do it. And we're talking in the time of the 1800s when the Napoleonic Wars, Franco-Prussian War, I mean, there's wars all over. French stretched so thin. Seems odd. Now, that one's clearly Chinese influence. This is a rather elder temple that shares many similarities with what you see in South America, including the material, the brick type material, and the layout. Obviously, am I saying this region has no individuality? Of course not. There's clearly a definitive Asian Vietnamese flair to it. But the buildings that they assign to be of importance, like this museum here, they share characteristics of it, but they have far more in common with what we call neoclassical buildings. This is a monument, one of many, and I throw these things in there not because they further some narrative that I have. In fact, I like things that sort of buck that idea. This is a clearly distinct type of temple, but the brick and the layout and the symmetry and so much of it just reminds me of something that is practical. It serves a function. This looks far too much like an electric coil. This looks far too much like a water feature that we see time and time again. And you just can't help but wonder if not in homage, if what they're imitating or mimicking is indeed something that at one point had a different purpose. And we're just sort of building our homes around the ruins of things that came before unwittingly. I don't know. Perhaps I'll never know. This is the Hanwha Arts Museum. And I like buildings like this because they show this sort of column look from the neoclassical look along with the flared rooftops. And this is like a good hybrid of what you would imagine French and Chinese influence would look like. And herein lies the rub to me, because I don't think there were 4 or 5 schools of thought and culture that dominated the whole world as far as aesthetics. The Vietnamese people, no doubt. I have a nephew who's Vietnamese. Actually, I have a nephew and a cousin that are Vietnamese. They're just as creative and rich culturally, linguistically, culinary as any other culture, distinctive in language and arts and defiant. If everything is French or Chinese, that really does a disservice to a lot of other peoples in the world. I think that while you see stylistic flares amongst these cultures, I do not believe that there's only 2 or 3 schools of architecture. I believe that these buildings and these structures and these layouts were practical. The art on the outside could be different, and it is different, but the layout and the structure, it belies something different to my brain. And perhaps I'm wrong. It very well could be, but it is just the thought that just no matter how much I immerse myself in the buildings and the cultures of other places, it just doesn't go away. It seems to me an amalgamation of styles: Indian influence, Indo-Chinese influence, Austronesian influence, perhaps European colonial influence, and that's apparent in all the ornamentation. But the design and the structure, the similarities that don't have to be there, they don't jive with what I know from humanity. And that's the rub I have. So this is a mosque here, and it's clearly a newer world building made in the image of what a mosque should be. And that's absolutely fine. That makes sense to me. But what the foundation of, it's similar to the fact that your phone camera still makes a clicking sound. The snap of a camera is meaningless. The dial tone on phones, your car horn. There's so many things that we do that are just a harken back. It's just because we always used to. It's because a phone used to sound like that. It's because a doorbell used to sound like that. It's not a bell anymore. Usually it's like a digital recording. And these things we kick down. So it's not out of the world to think that we kick down architectural styles and we kick down certain things like having these empty towers and having these little subterranean basements simply because that's the way we did it, and we reverse engineered it and thought it works, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a reason for it. In other words, your camera used to make that noise because it was actually a mechanism doing something. It was actually a shutter. Your grandfather clock was actually a bell chiming. It wasn't a recording, like an alarm. The cuckoo clock was actually a mechanism. And those things, we kick them down just, even though it serves no function, maybe as a stylistic throwback. So why wouldn't architecture be any different? I'm not sure if I articulated that properly, but you see these buildings. This is the center of political and cultural events, and this is the main gate, the citadel of Hanoi, which looks, despite this sort of Asian flourish, which you would expect everyone to put their artistic touch on things, looks just like a star fort. And you see this time and time again. This is another church here. Whether this is a modern building, it sort of looks like it to me. It's made an emulation of things of old. Why? This is the southern entrance to the Imperial City from the point of view of the flagpole monument. Incredibly wonderful structure. All these are. This is a mosque that's in Ho Chi Minh City, and it looks to me, if it's not built on the bone, this looks to me like an imitation. Nothing wrong with that. It's just these are imitations of something that possibly served a function at some point. There's another mosque, and this is a church in Bin Duong, and look at the statue. This is just why are we repeating these sort of pagan gods? And is this a saint in the Catholic faith? I'm not sure why we have to bring that. Why do we have to import that from France? And I don't think that we did. I think that is just a label slapped on many of these buildings, and I'll show you why I believe that in time here as we dive a little bit deeper in this. These could be anywhere. They're in Vietnam. They're not in South America. They are in Vietnam. And I understand religion shares the same. Okay, I understand. So much of this is religion. Yes. But also so much is unnecessary. God doesn't care who you pray from, I'm pretty sure. And this incredible structure made of brick, these temples, these aren't credited to the French. Well, you find these as far away as India to South America. And there just seem to be so many underlying themes that is the culture house. Very interesting symbology and imitation look here. This is the Octagon House in Lang. This is the pagoda. You've seen this Octagon houses in New York. The very same sort of layout, looking like this actually was once a large fountain. This recessed sort of courtyard here, where you see that everywhere. And this pagoda here, these imitation sort of electric coils. And I'm not being critical of this. These are gorgeous buildings. These are super fun, and even if they're built in imitation, they're lovely and stylistically wonderful. I mean, each one of them I could spend a whole day just looking at. But I am more intrigued by the idea that why couldn't Vietnam have constructed these on their own? Why do we have to say that the French did it? Anything interesting came from French or Spanish Jesuit missionaries. I feel like it does a disservice to the people of the area, and it's just unrealistic. I believe that these buildings were part of a shared culture that we all had, including peoples that were all across the world. And the backstory is that missionaries cover this up. Whatever we can't destroy, we credit to foreign missionaries, and that's how the narrative weavers try to blend this into saying we're not the same. Vietnamese, you're very different. The only reason you have different buildings from Europe is because the Europeans came there and constructed them on their own during the brief time they were there. And I find that to be highly unlikely, personally. Again, form your own opinions. I'm just throwing out ideas and things I see. But when I see the same sort of stone look, the stone veneer pasted over brick that you see everywhere, I just wonder from where they learned this. And these people, any people, are no less talented than anyone anywhere else. There's no elitism that exists talent-wise and culture-wise in Europe or anywhere else. But I believe they learned it from the same source, and they were built by the same culture, at least a culture that shared ideas and shared the knowledge. And whenever that culture collapsed or disappeared, and whoever sort of got there first spun the narrative and into a host of tens of thousands of millions of beleaguered, confused, scattered people, like a picture of Tower of Babel type event. And the first people to control the editors and the systematic behind-the-scenes group that controlled the narrative via publications and via monks and via everything to do with literature, including the ability to even understand, read, and write these languages, it just took precedence. And so much conflict. I mean, the fact that this exists in Vietnam, I don't know how long. If this were in Europe, they would say it would take 300 years to build off and on. But during one of the most tumultuous centuries in French history, we managed to build this. I don't see it. This is a fascinating building. This is a restaurant, and I believe this is all bamboo, which is just incredible. This is something that I'm not trying to find pictures that confirm a narrative in my mind. I'm just looking at the pictures that the buildings that they hold, the buildings I find interesting and the buildings that they hold to be in government positions. So all I do is I search for all the museums, libraries, government buildings, schools, cultural buildings, the monuments, the bridges, the lighthouses, and come what may. Whatever they look like, that's what I feature. That's what I'm looking at. It's a series of, it's like a hydra that I've dialed into the firehouses, insurance buildings, the banks, and look for similarities amongst those. So I start with a common theme of if you were to control a country, if you were to control a world, how would you do it? And you would establish these areas, the military, the insurance, the banks, the education, the government, and then all the offshoots from that. So the libraries, like I mentioned, the museums, the post offices, all these buildings. And if there's some common thread that all these departments share throughout all the nations, then that's what I'm looking for. So these buildings are all museums or libraries or palaces or castles. Hopefully I come across nations that have wildly different architecture from top to bottom. That's not what I see. What I see are stylistically different, absolutely, 100%, but way too much of this. Way too much of the same symmetry and way too much of the same construction, and the timelines simply don't make sense in certain parts of the world. And this is but one of them. This is in 1901, this photograph. And this is a fountain, as it looks like. I mean, how beautiful, though. I mean, let me take a back step in here, just say some of the artwork and some of this ornamentation is just gorgeous. And it's distinct in its own artistic flair, absolutely. It's the commonality that I find intriguing. The brick, the rose window, and the idea, almost the insulting idea, that it took French people to come here for 50 years to make things like this. I don't know. I suppose if everyone were a real He-Man, it's possible. This is just a building near the palace. Look at that door. It looks so medieval. It doesn't make sense to me. And this is a different mosque. There is a small percentage of Muslims that live in this nation state. Look at those urns. This looks like it's from India. This looks like it's from, well, anywhere. And the Star and Crescent. I mean, in this pattern here, this is a great example of confusion of what exactly we're looking at. And that's, to me, what doesn't make sense. This is Saigon in 1881, the Citadel. This is when it was a French colony, this giant star fort. And you see here there's a star fort even within what appears to be an even older star fort. And the French really only heavily got involved in this area at this time period. They were just allegedly accepting the surrender and becoming an unchallenged temporarily power. And to think that they did all of this, I just don't buy it. And there's another deeper reason why I don't buy it. We'll get into that in just a second. Here's a ridiculous post office, same as we see everywhere, a little crappy picture. And the Ministry of Defense building, which is essentially a giant modern-looking archway. I think this is that same mosque that we saw earlier, looking a little bit modern. And some of these pictures are a little low resolution, but you work with what you can here. This is the Notre Dame. We saw that earlier in Ho Chi Minh City. This is another post office. And with the "you won't fool me" yellow paint, I see the brick hiding in there and the wooden shutters, and it looks like it could be part of a New Orleans. This is the Ocean Cloud Pass and Hai Van Gate. And this monstrous People's Court doesn't look very at home in Vietnam, if you ask me. It might seem similar, but this is the town hall, and this is a different town hall in a different town. And there are areas like this which look like a rundown water feature, star fort or rundown industrial site versus a place of religion. So now let's take a look at some of the stories behind. So this one, for example, this is the Church of Immaculate Conception, and we're told that the construction begins in 1866 after Emperor Tujuk signed a treaty with the French promising not to harm the Christian community. So the first church was built in 1881. The second one began in 1916, which they don't tell you what happened to the first. It was completed in 1923. 6 years later, major storms devastated restated it. And the third one was built in 1933. There was an Indochina War, the first one, and the French took over the church, and it received some damage. But you can see how tumultuous the history of it is. And, I don't know. I mean, I suppose something built in 1916, but then it was destroyed by storms. That's the third one was built in 1933, yet it still looks like this. Now, like I said, I'm doing a shallow dive on these just to give you an idea of the backstory of some of these. This stuff is not hard to find, although certain aspects of the French colonial architecture in Vietnam is hard to find. This one we're told was designed in 1932. It's a railway station, and we're told it was largely unused since the railway was abandoned. But the construction of the railway began in 1908 and proceeded in stages. Finally, this one was built in 1932. I'll rate that as plausible. This one here, the Dalat Palace Hotel, we're told it's a popular French getaway, opened in 1922, and yet in 1925, a city health inspection reported that the kitchens and their surroundings exhibited a condition of considerable filth, at which point they modified it, cut out most of the ornamentation, and restored it. This is a picture of what it looked like in the 1920s, when it was newly constructed and yet also in complete and considerable filth 3 years later, and required a complete remodel. And just look at the neutered version of it today. From that to this, it's almost a crime against everything that lives. This is a market in the center district of Hanoi, built by the French in 1889 after being renovated several times. And you can see, this is a great example of, you see the old world stuff hanging on here, and then look at what it looked like in an old French postcard, allegedly in 1889, and then completely neutered, while its size and, I mean, it looks like an airship hangar, and what it looks like now. This is the Grand Palace of Hanoi, and if you see down here in the caption, you can see this is part of the Exposition Hanoi. That's right, the Grand Palace. So this is part of a World's Fair that took place in 1902 in Vietnam. Where have we heard that narrative before to explain away some of these buildings? Interesting, isn't it? A World's Fair, which is not recognized by the official World's Fair, whoever is in charge of analyzing these, yet it does exist. There's very little information about it, and even most of Cryptopedia sources where I found were dead links. I did find a document, which I'll get into in a minute, which describes how this palace fell apart during the first typhoon that hit the area. But the official story is that this was built for the 1902 World Trade Fair and completely destroyed by American airstrikes in World War II. Now, why would American air raids at the end of World War II completely destroy this building, except for 2 giant bronze lion statues? Interesting, isn't it? So a World's Fair in 1902, put together by the French, who just recently, the past decade or two, arriving out of so many conflicts and engaging in so many conflicts, still had the time to construct this massive World's Fair, and the building just so happened to be destroyed by bombs in World War II. Isn't that just amazing? It's almost like they just have one story and they just make that shoe fit everywhere. And I'm not sure if I buy it. This is the Haiphong Station, built in 1902, part of the railway. The Medical University, founded in 1902, the first modern university in Vietnam, and the second of all after the Temple of Literature. And you can just feel the grubby fingers of the controllers in all of this, can't you? This is the Hanoi Opera House, erected in 1901, and one of 3 that the French built during their brief time in Indochina. Imagine that. Imagine the artisans and the skilled tradesmen that would have to be imported all the way to Vietnam to construct this long-lasting cultural monument of such absolute grandeur. I mean, it's just the same symbolism. Why would you adapt the same symbols from I mean, there's a statement by Ho Chi Minh it's actually a Ho Chi Minh supporter, I believe, in Vietnam, that said to a New York Times reporter, I believe in the 60s, there you are, here, does this look like what you expect from Vietnam in 1907? Unbelievable. The same roads and the same little wheeled vehicles that you would see, and the same mustachioed controller feller that you would see anywhere. Okay. I mean, these stories just do not make sense to me. Nothing about this screams Southeast Asian. And I simply do not believe that a culture like Vietnam, who has fought off some of the largest empires ever known to mankind, the United States, the Chinese, and the French in the 1800s, that it has such cultural strength and such resistance to the outside that it can defy 1,000 years of Chinese rule, only to have their most important buildings be dominated by someone who's ever a blip. There's a quote to a New York Times reporter from a Ho Chi Minh supporter, I believe in the 60s, and he's mocking. He's saying, we endured Chinese rule for 1,000 years and French for 100 years. America, you were a blip. A blip. I mean, although impacts, I'm not trying to diminish the negative impact that the American involvement in Vietnam had, of course, was horrendous, but this is the culture that we're expected to believe couldn't come up with their own buildings, couldn't construct these things on their own. I just do not buy it. Nothing about it makes sense, but we'll keep going just for kicks. This is the Ho Chi Minh City Hall, and we're served it was the administrative house for past governments during the French colonial period, and in 1898, the, quote, Big Canal, well, the area was too muddy to lay a foundation here, which halted the project until 1898 after the canal was covered to be made into the boulevard, and it took 11 years to finish, and it was opened in 1909. And during the Vietnam War, it was used by governments and finally opened to the public in 2023. It was originally a grand hall with a clock tower on it, and it's such a gorgeous building. I don't know who to be offended at. And here you have it here, looking distinctly like what we would call Tartarian. Just like everything. This is a postcard from 1930 with the oxen and the cart. I mean, it's the same old shtick. And then plastered over eventually with propaganda. Barely concealed differences in the insignia. This is not an attack on Vietnam or its people or its culture. This is an attack on the narrative. The absolutely stunning Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon Opera House. Is it just me? Or do we just see the same? What could this possibly mean? And how could the French possibly pull this off? They claim this was completed in 1900, and it was the House of the National Assembly until the 60s. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think? This looks like something that would be built in Vietnam. And they were told in 1898 the construction of this theater commenced on the site of the old one. So whatever the old one was, it was completed in less than 1 year. We're told in 1943 they removed engravings and statues to make the theater look more youthful. And again, the theater was damaged in the 40s by the Allied aerial attacks against the Japanese Imperial Army. And more it's starting to look like World War II was one of the objectives was just to destroy as many historical sites as possible. I mean, it's getting hard to. At first that seems implausible, like we had bigger fish to fry. But the more and more I look into this, it just seems it's a story that repeats over and over again. And here again, you have the grand archway with the Taurus being outheld by the angels, as you see everywhere. And the more I look at these buildings, I try to come back from the fringe sometimes. I try. And then I see photos like this that we're told this was 1920, and it doesn't make sense. Why the roads are so barren, why the technology doesn't match. And then to read such flimsy backstories, such as the presidential palace here, which we're told, again, like everything is built between 1900, and we're told in 1954 Ho Chi Minh himself refused to live here for symbolic reasons, so he built a traditional Vietnamese stilt house and carp pond, and this became sort of a historical site. This Museum of Ho Chi Minh History, constructed in 1885, and it was supposed to house the Museum of Commercial Trade, becoming the residence of the governor, and on it goes. We are to believe this is the Saigon Central Post Office in 1895, built between 1886 and 1891, and now a tourist attraction. There's some speculation, some controversy into who the designer was. And here you've got the serpents around the pineal, and it just all is too weird for me to accept that this narrative is what they tell us. Why is this a post office? And how could this have been built in such a time frame? And we can go on and on. This is the ruins of a church that was a Catholic church built in the 19th century that was also happened to be destroyed by American bombing on February 11th, 1965. So now it just remains as a war relic. This one was built in 1876 by the French colonists. Back to this one. This one replaced replaced an earlier church, which was on the bank of the canal. After they filled in the canal, allegedly, imported all the building materials from France, and put the first stone down on 1863, when they're in the midst of the conflict. And not just this conflict. When I dove into French history at this time, it's a complete mess of revolutions, Napoleonic wars from Napoleon III. And on Easter Day, April 11th, 1880, they finally opened, adding bell towers a few years later with 6 bronze bells with a total weight of 28 tons, bronze statues, and it's really just too much. This is the church where the Virgin Mary statue allegedly shed tears in the 2000s. This one also built by France in 1910, built by France in 1884. So I don't know, folks. You tell me if I'm being too ridiculous. This is a water tower allegedly built in 1894. Before this, we're told Hanoi residents were using water from lakes and ponds. All of these are allegedly French colonial homes, and I see the architectural similarities. This is a memorial with the same symbolism to combat in 1899, and I just don't know if I buy it. I don't know. I mean, actually, I'm making it pretty clear that I don't buy it. I'm sorry if this is a little disjointed, but I just have a hard time. I'm not trying to doubt the French. I'm doubting the story. I don't believe there's any reason why the people that lived here couldn't be as blind and oblivious as we in America when we come across the same story in a place like San Francisco with the same stories, the same look of building, and we're given some cockamamie story about a World's Fair that takes away from the idea that maybe we're all united in a lot more ways than they would have us believe. I'm sure I'll be back to revisit this subject at some point, but for now, I'll see you soon.